Hello, thank you for buying the Valentine Heart Kit from 4 Bit Industries. This guide will show you how to solder it together. Let's start by taking an inventory. You should have in your kit a heart-shaped PCB, a tape with 14 resistors. You should have a foam piece with a 6-digit display, 3 tactile switches, a socket, and a chip. You should have a slide switch, a 9-volt battery connector, and a voltage regulator. So we're going to start with the items on the piece of foam. And in particular, we're going to start with the chip socket. Now the chip socket does have to be inserted the correct way around. You'll notice in one end of the chip socket is a little notch. And when you look at the outline of the chip socket on the board, this is called the footprint, you'll notice a notch in one end. So we're going to line up the two notches and insert the chip socket. Now to solder the chip socket, you are probably going to want to tape it into place. That way it won't begin to fall out or move around on you. Tape it down really well so it doesn't move. Then we'll flip it over. You should see a bunch of pins sticking through the holes there. If they're just barely sticking through, that means the chip has fallen a little bit. It needs to be pushed back into place. You can tape the board down for soldering. And then we're going to solder just one pin. So I'm going to take my iron, and I've got to get it in here so that I'm touching the pin and the pad, the little metal ring that's on the PCB. I need to touch both of them on the same time and flow a little bit of solder in there, and that'll make a nice solder connection. Now, why am I doing just one? Well, after I've soldered just that one pin, I'm going to check the alignment of my chip and make sure it's still in position the way I want it. If it's moved out of position, I can reflow that one solder joint, push it into position carefully because it might get hot, and that'll allow me to have a nice alignment on my chip socket for the rest of the soldering. So with one pin done and the socket still in position, I'm going to go ahead and solder the rest of the pins beginning at the opposite corner. These tend to solder up very quickly. They don't have much thermal mass, so they heat up very nicely for soldering. So next, let's move on to the tactile switches. These are the 3 tiny little switches that arrive in the foam. And they go into the positions marked SW1, SW3, SW4. These have bent leads, so you should find that you're able to insert them and they will stay in position for you for soldering. If they're falling out, just bend the leads a little bit with your thumb. You can usually get them to stay into place. So those 3 are staying in there well. Again, I can tape my board to my work surface so it doesn't move around while I'm soldering. If you have a helping hands tool or a PCB vise, of course you can use those as well. I'm going to clean my soldering iron, put a little bit of solder on it, and get to work. So we've soldered all 12 points for the 3 tactile switches, we'll now move on to the slide switch. Now the slide switch you want to have pointing outwards so it's easy to flip the switch back and forth. Just stick it in there, and you'll probably want to put a piece of tape on it to hold it into position. Depending on your PCB and how tight the holes are, it may hold itself in position just fine. But now you're going to want to solder all 5 of these pins. 3 of these pins make the electrical connection. The other 2 are just to hold the switch onto the PCB securely. But you do want to solder all 5. So I'm going to solder the center pin. And then just like I did for the socket, I'm going to make sure that that is in there nicely, that it hasn't moved around before I solder the other pins. To get the feet soldered, you need a good bit of heat. Make sure you get in there with your soldering iron so you're touching the pad and the foot very well. You can flow a little bit of solder between the foot and the iron to make sure you're making a good connection, a good thermal connection. And then flow a bunch of solder into that hole. You should fill the hole entirely. So there we go. Now we have a good physical connection between the switch and the PCB. One thing you can look for on all your solder joints is whether some solder has flowed onto the other side of the board. All of these holes are plated through holes, meaning there's a metal ring through the hole. And if that plated through hole got hot enough, the solder should travel through it and come out the top a little bit. That means you have a good solid solder connection. Alrighty, not a whole lot left to do. Let's move on to the regulator. So the voltage regulator, you can cut away from the tape or you can just pull it out. I like to cut it away so that I don't get glue on my PCB. But notice the footprint on the board. It has a flat side and a rounded side, just like the body of the regulator. You must insert this the correct way around or you will have problems. So get it so all 3 are in there. You can bend the outer 2 leads out a little bit, and that should hold it into place for soldering. Notice that the body of the regulator will not push flat against the board. That's the way it is by design. And there we go. All right, next we're going to solder in the display. Now it's very important to have the display right side up. And the way you decide which way is right side up is you look for the decimal points. There's a decimal point after each of the 6 digits, and you want the decimal points to be down towards the bottom of the heart. So we're going to carefully stick this multi-lead package with very long leads into the board, and you may have some trouble like I'm having trouble right now. And that's because these leads do tend to get bent a little bit. It's just a function of their being so long. So what I like to do is stick it halfway in, so these leads are in on this side. And then I'm just going to poke these leads with a little screwdriver while applying pressure with my thumb until I get it all the way in. So just a little tool to poke at it, whatever you've got. Just poke the leads in one at a time and it will go in. Now you might want to tape this into place. Again, double check that those decimal points are down before you cover it up. But to be honest, this thing will probably sit pretty well against the socket and the display if you don't want to tape it down. You want it to look good though. So once you've got it into position, these solder points are closer than the others, closer side to side. So we want to be careful soldering them. I will basically get my soldering iron in there from this direction, from the bottom or from the top, so that there's less chance of me accidentally touching two pins at the same time with the soldering iron. If you do touch two pins at the same time, there's a chance you will create what's called a solder bridge, where you have created a connection between two adjacent pins with a blob of solder that is connected to both of them. If you do that, it can be fixed. Just get your iron nice and clean, drag it right through the solder bridge, and a little bit of solder should come off on your iron, and the bridge should break into two separate solder joints. Alrighty, we've got all of those soldered. Now these leads are a little bit long, they stick out, so I am going to trim them. So do be sure to get all of the little pieces out so that they aren't creating any shorts. I've got one stuck right here. You may notice there's some gooey stuff left on your board after you solder. That is solder flux residue. And that can be cleaned off with isopropyl alcohol. The highest alcohol content you can get in your isopropyl alcohol, the better. And you can just get a brush wet with isopropyl alcohol and brush that goo away. Alrighty, so we only have two parts left. We have 14 resistors and the battery clip. We'll do the battery clip last. For the 14 resistors, again, like you did for the voltage regulator, we can just snip them away from the tape, or you can pull them out of the tape. All of these resistors are identical, and resistors are non-polarized, so there is no wrong way around to insert them. I just lost one onto the floor. Okay, so I've got my 14 LEDs cut, and we need to bend these in a particular way for this project. We need to bend them into J-hooks. So what we need to do is take a resistor, take one lead, and bend it around the body of the resistor so that both leads are pointing in the same direction. Just like that. And then when we look at the circuit board, I'll move the tape here. But when we look at our board, you'll notice there are some white circles around every other pair of holes And what those represent is the resistor body. So it's suggesting that you should insert this so that the body of the resistor is down and the other lead of the resistor goes in above it. It is not essential that you arrange these in an alternating pattern the way I am. Like I said, resistors are not polarized, so it really doesn't matter if you insert these backwards or upside down. I am going to bend the leads out to hold it in place for soldering. I will go ahead and solder one of these, and then I'm going to do the other 14. The other 13, excuse me. So again, these leads are fairly close. You don't want to get a solder bridge. But trim them after you've soldered them, and it should look like this. Alrighty, now I've got all 14 inserted. That was the hard part. Now I'm going to solder them up. Here I have accidentally crossed the leads. That's not good. There we go. Alrighty, so we've soldered in the 14 resistors and their leads are all trimmed. This is looking almost done. So the last thing we need to solder in is the 9-volt battery clip. And this one's a little unusual because we're going to insert it from the back and we're going to solder it from the front. Now, batteries are polarized, so we have to insert this the right way around. How do we know? Well, notice the clips. One is round, whereas one has a kind of square appearance. And on the board, you will see a square pad and a round pad. I need to make sure the square-looking clip matches up with the square pad and the round clip with the round pad, and insert it from the back like this. Then I can tape it into place for soldering to make sure it doesn't move around too much. And then we're going to flip the board around and solder it from the front. Now you'll notice the legs are not very long, but they should be protruding from the board. If they aren't sticking out of those holes at all, well then it's fallen out of place and we need to retape it. Now these are pretty fat leads and pretty big pads. So I'm going to clean my iron, get a little bit of solder on the tip, and then we are going to make sure to get our iron on the pad and the lead, and then we're just going to feed a whole bunch of solder in there. And if it forms a little bit of a dome over the lead, that's fine. It just means it's going to be nice and smooth. So there we go. Nice solid connection with a lot of solder. Alright, now I can take that lead off, or that tape off rather, and now we're all soldered up. Alright, now we have one last component in our kit, and that is the microchip. So we're going to carefully remove this from the foam. And you may notice that the legs are kind of splayed out. That's the way they come from the factory. And the way I like to straighten them so they're pointing straight down is I kind of roll it against a flat surface like the desk here and see if I can straighten all those pins at once. So I'll bend it a little bit on each side so they're a little more straight. And then you're going to want to look for the notch. There should be a notch in one end of your chip that matches the notch in the socket and the notch in the footprint. If there isn't a notch, then there's going to be a little dot next to pin number 1. Whether you have a dot or a notch, they both go at the same end. So we're going to carefully insert this with even pressure down into the socket, and then inspect it to make sure there are no pins bent out, no pins bent in, going underneath. Should look nice on all sides. So now that we have the chip in the socket, our display is done. Now let's figure out how to use it. Well, attach a 9-volt battery on the back. It's meant to stand up like this, but I will hold it so you can see it. And when you switch it on, you should get a default message going across. Those default messages come from actual conversation hearts. Now, it looks flickering in my camera because of the frame rate of the camera and the blink rate of the LEDs, but in real life this does look solid. So how do you program it? Well, if you want to enter your own custom message, it's pretty easy. Just hold down the set button, which is the button over here. Hold it down for a few seconds, and it will give you a cursor. Now you can hit up and down to find the letter you want, and with each letter, hit set momentarily to get to the next position. So I'm just going to have mine say hi. Now make sure to hit set to get that I entered, so the cursor should be over here before you end entering the program. So I've entered hi. I'm now going to hold down the set button until it begins displaying my message. And there you go. The message scrolls across and it repeats forever. Now, if you want to get back to the default message, you can hold down set until you get a cursor. But then to return to the default, instead of entering a message, just hold down set again until the default message begins scrolling across. And that's how you program the conversation heart. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch you next time.